Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Julia Chen. I am the Activities Director at the Yale Club, and I'm so excited to see so many of you joining us for our virtual lecture today. We're excited to bring you these live speakers and to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from the comfort of your homes. So today we are excited to welcome Jonathan Horn, who is a class of '04. He is an author and the former White House presidential speechwriter whose Robert E. Lee biography, The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, was a Washington Post bestseller. Jonathan has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS NewsHour, and his writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times Disunion series, Politico Magazine, the Daily Beast, the Weekly Standard, and many other outlets. His latest book is Washington's End, which chronicles the first president's life from his retirement in March 1797 to his death at age 67. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Yale Club of New York for hosting this tonight. I really wish I could be with so many of you, my fellow Yaleys, in person. And though we must be apart, we share memories of happier times that we spent together. And just as the song that we all learned at Yale promised, how bright they seem through memory's haze. During times like these, it's natural, I think, to be nostalgic for the past. There seems to be comfort in the past because the past seems devoid of the fear and suspense with which we face our own future at a moment like this. What we forget, of course, is that the people who lived in the past did not know how their stories were going to end and actually had many of the same fears that we have today. During the last years of George Washington's life, the period that we'll be discussing tonight, the country faced a series of devastating yellow fever epidemics. In 1793, 10%, an estimated 10% of the then capital of Philadelphia perished in one such epidemic. And if you look back at George Washington's correspondence during this period, you'll see that it was incredibly difficult for him to get accurate information about what was happening. People back then didn't even know what caused yellow fever. And you'll also see, I think, the paradox of our nostalgia, because what draws us to the past during these times of uncertainty is exactly what people back then never had, and that is clarity. And that might sound discouraging, but I actually think it should be hopeful for all of us tonight, because it's a reminder that our country has faced periods of great uncertainty before and emerged stronger, and we can do so again. Now, on a lighter note, there was one thing that George Washington was quite certain about during his last years, and it had nothing to do with yellow fever. It had to do with news that the step-grandson he had sent to that college in Princeton, New Jersey, had started up a correspondence with, well, a Yale man. And George Washington wasn't sure exactly what kind of ideas the Yale man was putting into the mind of his step-grandson, but he was sure that that correspondence was going to lead to trouble. He said, "No good can come of it, and much evil may." And I'm sorry, that's actually a real quote. So what does this mean for us tonight? Well, thanks for taking your chances by being in communication with this Yale graduate. It's been 5 years since I last spoke with the Yale Club of New York. Back then, as was kindly mentioned, I was on book tour for my first book, a Robert E. Lee biography titled The Man Who Would Not Be Washington. And when I finished writing that book, everyone made the joke that your next book should be about the man who actually was George Washington. And I had served as a White House speechwriter during the final years of a presidency, and I had seen what happens when a president leaves office and becomes a former president, and that got me interested in the question of what happened to our first president when he left office. And so you can imagine my surprise when I discovered that the full story of America's first post-presidency had never been told. And that may sound really surprising to you too, because you're probably thinking to yourself, how can that be? Given all the biographies of George Washington, no one had ever told the full story of his post-presidency before? Well, have a little sympathy for George Washington's biographers. Just consider how much ground they have to cover. This is a man, after all, who heard the first shots of the French and Indian War, who held the Continental Army together during the long American Revolution, who presided over the Constitutional Convention, and who served 2 terms as President of the United States. Along the way, he married the rich widow Martha Custis, helped raise her children and grandchildren from her previous marriage, presided over the vast 8,000-acre estate known as Mount Vernon, forced men, women, and children to work his land, and pondered how and when to set his slaves free, and became the most famous man in the United States. And by the time biographers get through all of that material, they tend to run out of time, and they've hit their page counts, and their editors are on the phone, and they're saying, "Where is your book? Turn in your book." And so as a result, the last years of George Washington's life tend to get shortchanged. So what gets left out? Well, George Washington left the presidency in March 1797, and he died in December 1799. That's a period of a little less than 3 years. I started writing this book in late 2015. So if you're doing the math at home, and some of you probably are, you can figure out that it took me more time to write the story of George Washington's last years than it took George Washington to actually live his last years. And now you're really saying, how is that possible? And there's someone else in my house who would really like an answer to that question. And that's my very, very supportive and very, very patient wife, who I'd like to add I met at Yale. And so I thought, what better place to try to explain the answer to that question than on a Zoom chat with my fellow Yaleys? And before I attempted, let me just say that after you spend a lot of time in the 18th century, when you come back, you don't come back as the most technologically savvy person. So I hope you'll excuse me if I'm doing anything wrong here with the computer, or there's not as many bells and whistles as you might imagine from other book talks. But I've just returned from spending most of my life in the 18th century and being buried in George Washington's correspondence when he couldn't have imagined such a thing as Zoom. So what did take so long to write this book? Well, at first, it seemed pretty straightforward. The book needed to start on March 4th, 1797. That was one of those days in history when people knew they were witnessing history. It was a day that George Washington had eagerly been awaiting for years. It was the day that if you had been in Philadelphia, you would have seen power peacefully pass from one living head of state to another, from George Washington to John Adams. As I mentioned, George Washington had been looking forward to this for years. He had actually wanted to leave the presidency after his first term in office, but he had been convinced that the country would come apart unless he agreed to serve a second term. And he almost immediately regrets this decision. And he says that he would rather be anywhere than be president of the United States. And by the time he finishes his second term in office, there really is no argument in the world that could have convinced him to serve a third term. Newspapers associated with the emerging opposition party had begun attacking George Washington for craving a crown and saying that he wanted to be king. They even accused him of embezzling money. And he understood that his legacy as the American Cincinnatus depended on leaving office and returning to his farm and living out what little days he expected to have left on this earth at Mount Vernon. He was 65 years old, and perhaps some physical description of George Washington at this point would be helpful. Well, he had recently lost his last tooth. He was very self-conscious about the way his dentures pushed out his lips. His back was stooped. His hand had acquired a slight tremble. His hearing had weakened, but not so much that he could not hear whispers about his senility. And his vision had declined. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. He did not expect to live much longer. He said he would never stray more than 20 miles from Mount Vernon ever again. He imagined occupying his time by riding around his farms, by putting his mansion house back in order. He felt that it had gone into decline, and by organizing his personal papers, because he knew that biographers like yours truly were one day going to want to see his papers. And if everything had gone according to plan, this would have been a pretty straightforward book to write. But nothing went according to plan. History was not done with George Washington at all. A little more than a year after he left office, George Washington was called out of retirement, put back in command of the armies of the United States amid a war scare, and drawn into very serious feuds with his immediate successor and his future successor. In short, George Washington's peaceful retirement ended up being anything but peaceful. It was filled with controversy, intrigue, and personal torment. Surrendering power turned out to be far more difficult than George Washington ever imagined. Now, to be fair, there really was no good precedent for George Washington to work off of. Americans at the time were well aware of the story of Cincinnatus, the Roman general who had famously left his farm, saved the Republic, and then returned to his farm. But that story was a few thousand years old. Just to understand, I think, how revolutionary what George Washington was attempting to do in his own time, you have to look across the ocean to Europe. Well, what was happening there? Well, Louis XVI of France had recently lost power, and he very shortly afterward had gone to the guillotine. And that's the way things tended to work in the world at that time. When heads of state lost power, they tended to lose their heads. And in a different sense, George Washington would also lose his head during this period. We use the word precedent a lot with George Washington when we talk about him, and he deserves a lot of credit for the precedents that he set, and they still guide our country today. No one did more. But if we're honest, I think we can admit that in some pretty significant ways, George Washington's post-presidency diverges from the way we think former presidents should act today. We today tend to think that former presidents should largely avoid meddling in the affairs of their successors. But if you had asked George Washington's successor, John Adams, he would have told you that George Washington majorly meddled. Now, some of it was John Adams' own fault, with France seizing American ships at sea, and with France being unwilling to meet American envoys on land. The United States began preparing for war in 1798, and it was John Adams who nominated George Washington to be commander-in-chief of the armies of the United States, without apparently bothering to even ponder why the Constitution specifically reserves that title for the President of the United States, or, and this is even more shocking, bothering to ask whether George Washington would have any conditions for acceptance. It turned out that George Washington did have some conditions for acceptance. He did not want to take active command of this army unless there was an actual invasion by France, and he wanted to choose his second in command, the person who would serve as the chief in his absence. And for that role, he wanted someone who he had been told, specifically told, that John Adams did not want. The star of everyone's favorite musical, Alexander Hamilton. Now, perhaps a word is necessary. Why did John Adams not want Alexander Hamilton? Well, it certainly didn't hurt that Alexander Hamilton had conspired against John Adams' election to the presidency in 1796. But privately, and more importantly, John Adams and his wife Abigail both believed that Alexander Hamilton more resembled a Caesar than a Cincinnatus. Now, publicly, John Adams could not afford a falling out with George Washington, who threatened to resign if he did not get his way. So ultimately, after some back and forth, some pretty significant back and forth, John Adams had to give way, and George Washington got his man. As John Adams told the story years later, if he had not given way, George Washington could have just simply run for president in the next election, beaten John Adams, and then appointed Hamilton as chief of the army anyway. And there's some evidence to suggest that John Adams was right to worry, as John Adams embraced an opportunity for new negotiations with France that ultimately averted a full-scale war with France. Influential people in communication with members of John Adams' own cabinet were plotting how to replace John Adams as president with George Washington. They were trying to persuade George Washington to accept a third term in the election of 1800. And much as George Washington tried to silence talk of this idea, it persisted. And I think that brings me to another significant way in which George Washington's post-presidency diverges from the way we think former presidents should act today. We today tend to think that leaving office elevates former presidents above petty political feuds. It raises them above partisanship. But the evidence shows that George Washington descended deeper than ever into partisanship. Now, I think that sounds so surprising because when we think of George Washington, we tend to think about his farewell address that he issued when he left the presidency. And it famously said, "Avoid the spirit of political parties." But less remembered is a letter that George Washington wrote toward the end of his life when he said that every American had a choice at this point between being a member of one party or another. Back then, the choice was being a Federalist or a Republican. And George Washington openly became a Federalist. He involved himself in congressional electioneering in a way that he never would have as president. He favored excluding Republicans from all high-ranking positions in the new army. It was going to be a partisan force. And he supported the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which actually led to newspaper printers associated with the opposition party being put in prison. And perhaps most significantly, George Washington was no longer on speaking terms with three of the most prominent Republicans. Perhaps you've heard their names before. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. That's your third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States. Just hearing a report of a speech that James Madison gave in favor of electing James Monroe, governor of Virginia, sent George Washington into an absolute rage on the evening of December 13th, 1799. That turned out to be the very last newspaper report that George Washington ever received because he died the next night in truly agonizing fashion. And perhaps it was for the best that he didn't actually live to see the election of 1800 because he would not have been happy at all with who won that election, Thomas Jefferson. So much for all of our founding fathers getting along. But there was one thing, it seems, that everyone in this time period agreed on, and that was that the country was coming apart, that they might be living in the last days of the American Republic. There was a time when people believed that George Washington was the one man who could hold America together. But Washington would have been the first to tell you at this point he no longer could. And when you go back and you look at what people back then were worried about, it sounds incredibly familiar to us. They were worried about foreign intervention in American elections. It actually happened in 1796. A foreign power had intervened on behalf of what was then called the Republican Party. Unsuccessfully, by the way, did not work. They back then were worried about new forms of media. Back then, it was partisan newspapers spreading what we today would call fake news. And they were worried about the increasing polarization of their society and the emergence of political parties. And just to give you a sense of how far this went, partisan politics even infected the response to yellow fever. I told you no one knew what caused the disease. And into this void, doctors leaned on partisan theories. Republican doctors tended to blame local environmental factors for the disease. Federalist doctors tended to blame immigration. So no wonder people thought the country was coming apart. But of course, the country did not come apart. It endured. And the war with France, as I mentioned, never really ended up happening. And that was the greatest challenge for me as a biographer, is how do you write a history of things that did not end up happening? How do you explain why people who most of us admire made decisions and thought in certain ways that seem illogical in hindsight? Now, one approach, I think, is just to tell the story from the comforts of the 21st century. But the problem with that approach is that it robs the past of the suspense and uncertainty with which people actually experienced it. And it gives us the smug self-confidence to think that we would have made better decisions had we been alive back then. And nothing could be further from the truth. I don't think you can judge a decision that somebody made in the past unless you understand what information they were dealing with. And so I made a decision when I was writing this book. And that decision was that I would only present the reader with information that was then known to the people I was writing about. And I would only introduce new information as it became known to them. And the effect, I hope, is to allow the reader to experience the past through the eyes of the people who lived it. Now, of course, that raises another question the biographer must settle. Whose eyes do you tell the story from? And again, the temptation is just to say, oh, George Washington's eyes, done. Well, remember what I said. George Washington's eyes were no longer as good as they had once been. Objects that looked clear in the distance blurred as they approached. He could no longer see himself clearly. The story of an aging patriarch struggling to cede control needed to make room for new perspectives. Family members, friends, foes, other members of the Mount Vernon community. And George Washington could no longer dominate their stories the way he once had. His name itself was no longer even his own. He could not even speak for his name because it belonged to a rising capital city that would open just months after George Washington died. George Washington had high hopes for this place. It didn't look like much back then. It was just some wide, unpaved avenues cut through trees. At the end of the major thoroughfare was, one end of it was one wing of the Capitol. At the end of the other wing was a boxy, grayish-white house. But as I said, Washington had high hopes for this place. It was he who had chosen the spot for the city on the Potomac River, just upriver from Mount Vernon. It was he who had overseen its construction during his presidency. And it was he who had given his name to the place, Washington. He hoped it could do what he manifestly no longer could, and that was hold together the feuding and factions tearing the country apart. And that was the ultimate realization for me as a biographer. The story I needed to tell was not just about Washington's end, it was about the beginning of Washington, the city I call home. It wasn't just about the last 3 years of George Washington's life. It was about everything that has come afterward. Looking back on the strange course that his post-presidency took, and no one was more surprised than George Washington by what course it took during the final months of his life, George Washington said, "We know little of ourselves and much less the designs of Providence." Well, I think that's true for us as well. I could not have imagined how long it would take me to write this book when I started. I could not have imagined where it would lead me, but I'm very happy to find myself here on Zoom with all of you this evening. Thank you so much, and I'd be honored to answer your questions. But before I do, let me just say one word, which is this is a really difficult time for independent bookstores. And if everyone could do something to support independent bookstores during this period by going to this fabulous new website called bookshop.org, and the Yale Club can give you a link to this site. It's a way of supporting independent bookstores during a very difficult period for them, and it means a lot to authors and publishers and everyone who cares about books in this country. But so thank you so much, and I would be honored to answer your questions.
And thank you, Jonathan. That was fascinating. And while I give everyone a chance to orient themselves and think of any questions that they have, I was hoping, Jonathan, you could tell us a little bit more about, obviously, Washington did not want to come out of retirement. Can you tell us more about his struggle as he had to make that decision?
Right, and that's a fabulous question to start with. This was a very difficult decision for Washington to make. He struggled with it. On one hand, he knew that he was going to accept this command if it was offered, because he couldn't sit on the sidelines if everything, as he said, he had devoted his life to was threatened. On the other hand, he really worried, as he always did, about what other people would say. He worried they would say he was too old to command the armies of the United States. France had been having incredible success with younger generals. Perhaps you've heard of one of those generals, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was also worried that people would say his farewell had been a sham, that he couldn't be happy in retirement, and that he needed to be in control of things. And he was also worried, most worried, I would say, about what this would do to his legacy. He was worried about the prospect of failure. And that's one of the reasons that I think it was so important that he could pick his fellow general officers. And it's one of the reasons he wanted someone in the second command slot in particular that he could trust, and ultimately led him to Alexander Hamilton. And I think that goes quite a distance toward explaining how this very serious feud took place between George Washington and John Adams. And when you step back and think about it, what were they fighting about? Well, they really, in a sense, were fighting about control of the United States Army. And so this was a very serious conflict, and it takes place and it involves all of John Adams's cabinet secretaries too, as they were relaying information back and forth between John Adams and George Washington, who did not like to write to each other directly for the most part. And again, what side did John Adams's cabinet tend to take in the feud? They mostly sided with George Washington. And if you wonder why, it's because John Adams had made a pretty serious mistake. He had decided to retain all of George Washington's cabinet secretaries. And so those cabinet secretaries had continued to be in very close communication with George Washington, who constantly, even before this happened, had been writing them letters saying, every once in a while, if you want to send me a letter and fill me in on what's happening in Philadelphia, I wouldn't mind receiving your report. So thank you for that question.
Of course. And so we have a couple through the chat, so I'll just go in order. From Robert is asking, what was Washington's public reputation when he left office, and how did it evolve over the period your book covers? And when did he become iconic?
Well, that's a great question. And I think we should say that George Washington was already iconic. People were already naming their children after George Washington. We were already naming towns after George Washington. And I think perhaps the best way to understand how iconic George Washington is to revisit this moment on March 4th, 1797, which was the inauguration of John Adams. And the best account we have of this day, like so much else, comes from John Adams. And he looks around the room and he sees that everybody has tears in their eyes. But then there's this moment when he realizes that none of the tears are because people are so moved that John Adams has finally made it to the presidency. They're all have tears in their eyes because George Washington is leaving office. And that just gives you an idea of the stature of what George Washington occupied. People understood that what he was doing was making history. They were witnessing something unique in the story of America, a story of not just American history, but of world history. Now, I said that, but there were also some people, and this is harder for us to believe, who celebrated George Washington leaving office, not because he was setting this terrific new precedent, but because they thought he was a bad president. And these were members of the emerging Republican Party. And there were newspaper editors who were associated with that party. And you would be surprised by some of the things that were published during this period as Washington is preparing to pack his bags and leave Philadelphia. There are people writing things saying, good riddance, finally our republic is saved, and the man who wanted to be king will not be king, and we can be a true republic. And that's really hard, I think, for us to go back and visit. And you might ask, how did George Washington feel about this? Was he aware of these attacks? Yes, he certainly was aware of these attacks. In fact, he had spent his final day, full day as president, putting on record in the State Department a memo debunking a series of forged letters that had been reprinted that would have suggested that George Washington had actually been a lukewarm patriot during the American Revolution. So I think that gives you an idea of just how sensitive George Washington was. And these attacks really did wound him much deeper than people imagine. And it's one of the reasons why he was so eager to leave the presidency.
Great. So next question is asking, were you surprised by the parallels with the modern times?
Yes, I was very much surprised by the parallels with the modern times, because I think, there's this temptation to think, I think in every period of time, as I was writing this book, I sort of came to the realization that we all sort of think we're living in Washington's end, and not in the end of George Washington, but the end of Washington, the city. The city is coming apart. Our politics are reaching a period where they cannot continue. Things have never been worse. But what's interesting is when you look at American history, those feelings have almost always existed, and people have almost always thought that there was a better time than the time they were living in. They longed for the past, and they looked to the future with some amount of fear that this country can't possibly hold together. And there is real pessimism during George Washington's last years for a variety of reasons. And George Washington was really worried what would happen if the Republican Party, for example, came to power, as it did in the election of 1800. And so, as I said, I think it's for the best, probably, that he did not live to see that event.
Great. So question from Sylvia, how did Martha deal with the post-presidency?
That's a fabulous question. And I should say we have a tremendous loss to history, and that's because when George Washington died, Martha Washington burned their marital correspondence. So we don't exactly know what they were writing to each other, but we probably can assume that George Washington was okay with this decision to burn their correspondence, as much as it pains us today to think about what we lost. But that said, we do have some idea of what might have been in the correspondence, because George Washington described it very early on and during his post-presidency. And he said that if anyone was to read the letters that he and Martha exchanged, they would find them less filled with expressions of enamored love and more filled with expressions of friendship, partnership. And I think that's probably a good way of understanding their marriage. Rarely were they alone, because there were always people coming to Mount Vernon to try to eat dinner with George Washington and see the most famous man in America. But always did George and Martha like to be near each other and be together. And she was very proud, I think, of her husband's legacy. So much so that after he died, we have this one incredible story that basically Thomas Jefferson, and we can get into some reasons why Thomas Jefferson and George Washington's relationship was not good during these last years. There are a lot of reasons for that. But fair to say that after George Washington died, Thomas Jefferson was exceptionally careful about what he said. In fact, some people believed he almost made no public statement on the passing of George Washington because he didn't want to, I think if he had done something over the top, people would have probably accused him of hypocrisy. But there's finally this moment, and the election of 1800, as some of you may know, was mainly it was a complicated election that ended up in the House of Representatives, and Thomas Jefferson was going to need a little bit of Federalist help to get over the edge. And it turned out he didn't actually need Federalist help; he just needed enough Federalists to withhold their votes in the House. But some act of trying to show he was on good terms with Washington's legacy seemed like a good move. So he makes a trip to Mount Vernon to pay his respects to Martha Washington, the widow Martha Washington. And Martha Washington has to receive Thomas Jefferson, who of course is the leader of the Republican Party, which her husband really hated. And Martha Washington afterward describes this as the worst moment of her life other than her husband dying, because it pains her to have to receive Thomas Jefferson. She thinks he's only there for political benefit. And I think that just gives you an idea of just how strained this relationship was. And it also gives you an idea that Martha was very much involved with the politics of the period as well in her own way.
Wow. So next question from Mary. Why did Washington like Hamilton so much?
Well, I think he felt comfortable with Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had served as George Washington's aide during the American Revolution, of course, and he had written many letters for George Washington. And in some sense, it was a controversial decision. And actually, Washington's own first instinct was to put someone else in command, someone who had maybe had some general experience as a general during the American Revolution. Hamilton had never really risen above a colonelcy during the American Revolution. And Washington realized, put aside Adams's own feelings about Alexander Hamilton, that other officers who had served in the American Revolution might be offended if they were asked to serve under Alexander Hamilton. But there's this strange concerted effort to convince Washington. Letters come to him saying, everybody expects you to appoint Alexander Hamilton as second in command, and the whole Federalist Party supports it. And some of these letters are coming actually from cabinet secretaries. John Adams' cabinet secretary of state writes the most influential letters suggesting that George Washington should appoint Alexander Hamilton as second in command, because he says the whole country expects it. Now think about that. John Adams doesn't want Alexander Hamilton. His secretary of state is writing George Washington a private letter saying, appoint Alexander Hamilton. And naturally, eventually, the Adamses come to see this as sort of a conspiracy against them to appoint Hamilton to this position. So Washington sort of struggles about the decision. He worries that it will anger other officers, as it does. Henry Knox, who was perhaps one of the generals who was closest to George Washington, refuses to serve under Alexander Hamilton and will not take part in this new army, which actually pains George Washington. But ultimately, Washington makes the decision for two reasons. First, because he believes, he's been led to believe that most of this good Federalists in the country support Hamilton and would want him in this role. And also because he does believe, even though Hamilton had never served as a general during the American Revolution, he had an opportunity by being Washington's secretary to have a wide view of the war and to sort of see it through the eyes of the commander-in-chief, and he felt that no one would be more prepared to step into his shoes at this stage, if necessary, than Alexander Hamilton.
Wow. So next question, is it true that Washington's physician basically bled him to death? He might have survived had that not been the case. Question from John, class of 67.
Great question, great question. So basically, why did George Washington die? Well, basically, the shortest way to put it is he had an infection in his throat. His epiglottis swelled up and basically suffocated or choked him to death very slowly. It was a terrible way to die. The modern diagnosis is usually called acute epiglottitis. Of course, that was not what they chose to call it back then. In fact, they had a little debate. There were 3 doctors tending to George Washington during his final illness, and they had a debate over what to call it. And outside the room where George Washington was dying, which is almost sort of absurd to consider as it was happening. And so there actually was one doctor who had the idea that perhaps we should stop bleeding George Washington. And by the way, I should say one thing about bleeding, which is even George Washington himself thought bleeding was the best cure for what he had. Before the doctors had arrived, he had someone who worked at Mount Vernon begin the bleeding. And and this person was a little bit reserved about drawing too much blood from George Washington. And Martha Washington actually thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea to take all this blood. And she said, stop. And George Washington said, no, more, take more blood. So he thought this was effective. And so did all the best doctors of the age. But there was one doctor there and he himself thought bleeding was usually the best course of action. But he thought perhaps in George Washington's case, they should stop bleeding and they had bled enough. And maybe instead they should attempt something novel, a tracheotomy, which would be basically poking a hole in George Washington's throat, windpipe, to bypass whatever was obstructing his breath. Now, would this have worked? Hypothetically, potentially, I guess, but given the state of 18th century medicine, probably George Washington would have died. Now, did he die from the bleeding? I don't think so. No, I think he died from basically being choked and suffocated to death. His epiglottis was swelling up and blocking airflow. So he would have died anyway, but certainly the bleeding made it extremely unpleasant. But we should be careful about blaming the doctors too much because, as I said, they were doing what they thought was best at the time and what George Washington himself thought was the best thing to do too.
Is this something that would have been easily treatable nowadays?
Yes, with antibiotics would certainly help.
Right, yes. So question from Kathleen. How did Washington's curation of his papers color a historian's ability to accurately capture the man and define his legacy?
Fantastic question. And this was something that was much on George Washington's mind during his last years. I said one of his goals for his post-presidency was to organize his papers. And he actually had the idea, I think we can say, for the first presidential library. He wanted to put up a structure in Mount Vernon to contain his papers, which, as he described them, were voluminous. Now, he also spent his time doing something else during his post-presidency that may surprise you. He spent some time editing his letters, making some changes to his letters, especially during the French and Indian War. And you might say, what kind of changes was he doing? Was he trying to revise history? Was he trying to change decisions he made? Was he trying to color a perspective? Well, what's really interesting, when you look at the changes, you see that for the most part, the answer is no, he was trying to clean up his grammar. He was self-conscious, I think, about the way he had written as a younger man, and he was cleaning up his grammar and making it have a better flow. And I should say something else about that, which is when you look at George Washington's letters, a lot of his contemporaries accused him of being illiterate. They said he didn't write his own letters. This was always sort of whispered about in the background, that he had smarter people write his letters. But when you look at the letters he actually wrote, I have to say he was an incredibly effective writer, and he's underestimated as a writer. And I think he would be a very effective emailer today. He had a very crisp way of describing what he thought and letting people know what his tone was. And I think he was a very effective letter writer. Anyway, so he did understand that people were going to one day want to see his papers. And so the other interesting thing about that, of course, is he writes his letters with some perspective that people like me are going to one day be reading them. So how does that affect his letters? Well, I think what's great about this last few years of his life, he's still, of course, aware that everything he's writing is going to be read, But in some sense, he gets so frustrated during different points that he'll write letters that say, burn this letter. I don't want anyone seeing this letter. And how do we know that? Well, because people didn't listen to him. They didn't burn the letter. And I can see the letter today, and so can you. And so we can see what he didn't want us to see. And it gives us some indication of where his mind really was. And I think this period and the early period of his life are probably the two best opportunities to get a sense of who George Washington actually was.
And speaking of that period of time, question from Mary, how much time did Washington actually spend at Mount Vernon after he left the presidency?
Almost all of it, to be honest. He had said he was not going to stray more than 20 miles from Mount Vernon again, and it seemed like he was going to hold to that promise. He was spending his time riding around his farms. He still had lots of dinner guests who were coming to visit him. There were always guests coming to Mount Vernon. Everybody wanted to dine with George Washington. He described the place as a tavern in some sense. At the same time, though, something does happen. After he accepts the role of commander-in-chief, he does get drawn back to Philadelphia, which he had sworn he would never do, but he does make this re-entry into the capital city during the fall of 1798. And by the way, he comes in just as another yellow fever epidemic is ending. And it's a short trip to Philadelphia, but it's a consequential one. He meets with Alexander Hamilton and some of the other generals he has appointed. And it's sort of a difficult period of a lot of paperwork. They're trying to put together what's being called a new army. And I think he's very busy. He's keeping long hours. He does still find time for some socializing, though. And then he returns to Mount Vernon. And after that, he does again stick to the promise not to stray more than 20 miles from Mount Vernon ever again.
So a question from Jeffrey. Did George Washington ever get credit while living for doing the magnanimous thing and resigning, giving us our system of peaceful presidential transition? Or was this credit that he received posthumously?
Terrific question. And yes, the answer is yes, he did receive credit. People understood that they really were witnessing something historic. And George Washington does deserve credit for this, because I think today, when we think about the words former president, they almost sound cliche to us. But there was nothing cliche about the idea of a former president in George Washington's time. It was almost unthinkable, the idea of someone leaving power. We have a story after the American Revolution. And by the way, it's important to say George Washington had already done this once. He had done this after the American Revolution, which was seen as a similar act when he surrendered his commission to the Continental Congress and returned to Mount Vernon. And he was sensitive back then, how would it look after that he had done that to return to the Constitutional Convention and then eventually to become president of the United States? What would people say about that? He was constantly asking what would people say about decisions he was going to make, because he knew that you and I were going to be talking about George Washington, I think, all these years later. But again, people really did understand that what he was doing was consequential. And one of the great stories we have is that King George III was told that George Washington was planning to surrender his commission at the end of the American Revolution. And as the story goes, he said, well, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world.
So we have a question from Mary asking you mentioned this earlier, but to please elaborate on the reasons why Jefferson and Washington's relationship was not good in these final years.
Well, that's a great question. And Jefferson had served as George Washington's Secretary of State during George Washington's presidency. He was the first Secretary of State. And Jefferson was one of the people who actually played a significant role in convincing George Washington to serve a second term as president. He had said the country would come apart if you don't serve as president, because you're the only person who can hold this country together. Now, meanwhile, there's a very serious feud happening in Washington's own cabinet. Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. He's the head of what's becoming the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson is the head of what's becoming the Republican Party. And of course, there are no formal political parties at this point, but these affiliations, these associations are starting to become clearer and clearer, and Washington's watching it. And Jefferson says, you are the only person who can hold the country together. So after Washington accepts the second term, what does Jefferson do? Well, he decides to leave. And he's going to go back to Monticello and retire. He's going to do the very thing he told George Washington he couldn't do. He wants to go back to Monticello and be a farmer. And then very shortly after Jefferson leaves the cabinet, Washington starts hearing reports that Jefferson's not saying some great things about George Washington. He's saying that Washington has fallen under the influence of people who are pawns for the British, read Alexander Hamilton. And these reports keep coming, and eventually Washington will confront Jefferson in 1796 and say, I've been hearing reports, and I automatically dismissed them because I couldn't believe my good friend Thomas Jefferson would ever say anything like this about me. It's actually quite a fabulous letter. And then after George Washington does leave the presidency, a letter appears in the newspaper. It's a leaked letter. Back then, as today, everything leaked. Nothing stayed private for long. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson had written a letter to a friend in Italy, and he had said that you wouldn't believe that people who had been basically that very powerful people had become stooges for the British, and everyone reads this when it leaks into the press as an indictment of George Washington. By the way, Jefferson's own language is more colorful than that. I'll let you guys look up the original language. And it's seen as a very serious attack on George Washington. And as far as we know, Washington didn't really respond, but it got a lot of attention. And Jefferson debated, how do I take this on? And he ultimately ended up saying nothing about it publicly. But what ultimately just permanently destroys the prospect of any future communication between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington is this absolutely bizarre incident that takes place where George Washington one day receives a letter from somebody saying, I feel very bad about all the attacks on your character that the Republicans are making. I'm a big fan of yours. Feel free to write me, and we can commiserate about these attacks. So George Washington writes sort of a bland letter back, and then he very shortly afterward receives a letter from somebody else saying, "Hey, that letter you just received from someone claiming to be your friend and commiserating about the attacks you're receiving on your character, it comes from Thomas Jefferson's nephew, right under a fake name." And George Washington then is left with the question was Thomas Jefferson trying to get his nephew to write me a fake letter to get me to write something bad about Thomas Jefferson so he could even the score, and then he could leak that letter with me saying something bad about Thomas Jefferson into the press? And so George Washington wants evidence that Thomas Jefferson was behind this bizarre plot. And that is ultimately the moment from which there was no return. And George Washington sort of says, he starts calling Thomas Jefferson that man. And I think he really did believe Thomas Jefferson was behind the plot. Now, as it turns out, Jefferson was not behind the plot. It really was a ridiculous, crazy plot, and it was incredibly immature, and it really was his nephew acting on his own will. I don't think Jefferson would have condoned such a ridiculous plot. But it was a great consequence to the Washington-Jefferson relationship.
That is hilarious how that all came about. I believe we had Ed raising their hand to see if they still had their question.
Did George Washington ever look at his slaves to try to free them, or what was his thinking about the slaves he had at the time? Because I visited Mount Vernon and I saw the slave quarters, and I just wondered how he felt about the slaves and if he ever thought about freeing them.
That's a terrific question. I'm glad you asked that because I alluded to that in the very beginning of my speech and I didn't really get to it. And so that's something I'd like to be able to address, which is, it's someone famously said that in George Washington's will, he provided eventual emancipation for his slaves. But it's important to understand that George Washington owned less than half of the Mount Vernon slaves. A plurality of the slaves belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, and George Washington could not free those slaves. They were beyond his ability to free. Actually, Martha herself couldn't have provided freedom for those slaves, even if she had wanted to. And by the way, it's not clear that Martha would have wanted to free them as George Washington did. And so in his will, George Washington actually does look and he does explore different possibilities. Would there be a way to provide freedom for all of the slaves? Because why is that so important to him? Well, first off, he understands, I think, at this point that his legacy would be improved if he could find a way to provide freedom for all of Mount Vernon's slaves. Second of all, and probably most importantly, he has come to the conclusion that slavery is not an efficient labor system at Mount Vernon. And that is probably the most important factor guiding George Washington to this decision. He feels that he doesn't have enough work for the men and women he holds in bondage at Mount Vernon. And why is that? Well, part of the reason is that he had switched away from tobacco, which is a very labor-intensive crop, to wheat and other grains. I'm sorry, I almost knocked over my computer there. And so as a result, he feels that he has more than double the amount of slaves he can use. So what's very interesting is, as he's writing this clause in his will to provide eventual freedom for his slaves, he's also looking for new ways to keep them busy at Mount Vernon. Now, so what he writes in his will is that basically he acknowledges that painful consequences are going to result from this, because he's going to provide eventual freedom for his slaves when Martha also dies. But he acknowledges he cannot free the slaves who belong to the estate of Martha's first husband. Their fate rests with Martha's 4 grandchildren. They'll be divided among them. So in a sense, Mount Vernon's fate is very similar to that of, and by the way, so I'm sorry, I neglected to mention a very important point. Why is it going to be painful? Well, because his slaves have married these so-called dower slaves who belong to the estate of Martha's first husband. So as a result, freeing his slaves, he realizes, is going to lead to marriages being broken up, which is something that he largely tries to avoid doing. He doesn't want to break up their marriages. He respects these marriages, even though Virginia law doesn't actually credit these marriages. He does. So he writes in his will that painful consequences will ensue as a result. And so in some way, the fate of Mount Vernon is very much like the fate of our country as a whole. It ends up being half slave and half free. It ultimately falls to Martha Washington to act on this provision that provides freedom for George Washington's share of the slaves. The clause says they'll get their freedom automatically when she also dies. But she chooses to make the decision beforehand. And the reason we're given is that she began to fear for her life, that perhaps that they, as people became aware that their freedom would come as soon as she died, there would be an incentive perhaps to murder her. So she decides that the safest course of action for her, as she sees it, is to set the slaves free early, which she does do. And by the way, what happens to these slaves who belong to the estate of her first husband? Well, they are divided among the 4 grandchildren of Martha Washington. We actually have a draft, what it seems like a draft list of the 4 grandchildren dividing up those slaves, which is sort of just tragic, absolutely tragic to see.
So I think, which is a great last question from Mary, can you please share some more anecdotes about how politics at the founding of our nation are similar to today? For example, you mentioned fake news and rivalries.
Well, that's a great question. Maybe the best way to end is with a tell-all book. James Monroe had served as George Washington's minister to France for a time period, and George Washington had recalled James Monroe because he had not thought he had done a particularly good job. And so during George Washington's post-presidency, there all of a sudden appears a tell-all, what we call a tell-all book from James Monroe, attacking George Washington's foreign policy. And this book absolutely enrages George Washington. Now, how do we know it absolutely enrages George Washington? Well, we have his annotations of the book, and he is scribbling angry things in the margins as he reads. And you can see he really wants to respond, but he feels he can't respond publicly. So he's taking out his anger on this book. And he even makes fun of the idea that James Monroe might one day be president of the United States. And he says it in a dismissive way, like it'd be a completely absurd idea. So again, it's probably better that he didn't live to see what actually happened, which was President James Monroe. There probably was no one that George Washington liked less in public life than James Monroe. But that's a great question.
Yeah, and that is a great place to end. So thank you so much, Jonathan. I enjoyed this thoroughly. I got to reread your book now with all of what you said in mind. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Great. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have lots more programming coming up, but I will be sending out a recording of this lecture as well as the link to purchase the book through bookshop.org that Jonathan mentioned. Otherwise, check out the online calendar. We hope to see you at another event soon. Until then, stay home, stay safe, stay connected. See you all next time.